Simone Weil by Francine Du Plessix Gray. Copyright 2001 by Francine Du Plessix Gray. This full-length reading was published by arrangement with Viking Penguin, a division of Penguin Putman Incorporated, and was produced in 2001 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. The book's dedication reads, "To the memory of Lieutenant Bertrand Du Plessix, Force Aérienne Française Libre, 1902 to 1940." And it is prefaced by some French verse and its translation. Heureux ceux qui sont morts, car ils sont retournés dans la première argile et la première terre. Heureux ceux qui sont morts dans une juste guerre, heureux les épis mûrs et les blés moissonnés. Heureux ceux qui sont morts dans une guerre antique, heureux les vases purs et les rois couronnés. Blessed are the dead, for they have returned to original clay and primeval earth. Blessed are those who died in a just war. Blessed the ripened sheaves and the harvested wheat. Blessed are those who died in an ancient war. Blessed are pure vessels and anointed kings. Charles Péguy. Part 1. Home. Chapter 1. The Factory of Genius. Growing up in Paris in the first decades of the 20th century were two contented children from whose household all toys and dolls had been categorically banned. It had been their mother's intent to nurture their intellectual skills, and the gambit had obviously worked. The older child, André Weil, born in 1906, was solving the most advanced mathematical problems by the time he was 9. By the age of 12, he had taught himself classical Greek and Sanskrit and become an accomplished violinist. His sister Simone, 3 years his junior, a strikingly beautiful girl with dark, limpid eyes, was reading the evening paper aloud to her family when she was 5, and would master Greek and several modern languages in her early teens. The siblings often communicated with each other in spontaneously rhymed couplets or in ancient Greek. When reciting scenes from Corneille or Racine, they corrected each other with a slap in the face when one of them made a mistake or missed a beat. Theirs was a hermetic, rarefied world. The young Weil's conversations, though never meant to exclude anyone, were so laced with literary and philosophical allusions that they were barely accessible to outsiders. Who could have guessed, for instance, that Simone's recitation of the lament for Hippolyte from Racine's Phèdre was meant to inform her brother that she had completed her Latin composition and was ready to study Aeschylus with him as soon as he was finished with his differential calculus. The Weil's saga begins, as so many do, with the myth of the perfectly happy family. The uncommon brilliance and talents of their son and daughter may have been the crowning glory of the Weil's cosseted lives, but it was hardly the only one. Dr. Bernard Weil's practice as an internist had thrived ever since he had opened it. His wife, Selma, was a dynamic woman who radiated intelligence and joie de vivre, and their mutual devotion was legendary. As for the early flowering of the Weil children's genius, how could one have wished for more amazing children? Madame Weil was almost totally responsible. Dr. Weil, kind, loving, and thoroughly enlightened, but taciturn and easily overwhelmed by his forceful spouse, was far too busy with his medical practice and let his wife make the major decisions concerning their children's education. Selma, also known in the family as Mime, had much desired in her youth to become a doctor. Her father having forbidden her, for the usual patriarchal reasons, to go to medical school, she seemed to have rechanneled her vast energies and ambitions into her children's success. Because few educators were skilled enough in her judgment to stand up to her sons and daughters' formidable gifts, within a span of 5 years, Simone and André would attend more than a half-dozen schools and be instructed by scores of private tutors. One might well say that the dominating Selma Weil was a genius factory of sorts, masterminding every move in her children's intellectual training, tapping every available educational resource to assure the fulfillment of their talents. Madame Weil was as scrupulous about her children's physical well-being as she was about their education. A phobic dread of microbes ruled her household. The Weils were close friends of the eminent Russian-born microbiologist Elie Metchnikoff, a director of the Pasteur Institute, who had won the Nobel Prize in 1908 for his pioneering research on infectious diseases. Having picked up from the scientist, as André Weil later wrote, a dread of germs which Simone would carry to an extreme, Madame Weil ruled that her children should not be kissed by anyone outside the immediate family. When she took her son and daughter onto a Paris bus, she had them sit on the top deck so as to minimize any chance of infection. Compulsive hand-washing was another habit she imposed on her children. At mealtimes, if André and Simone needed to open a door after having washed their hands, they had to shove it open with an elbow. These phobias about food and germs would strongly affect Simone's psychic makeup. The word dégoûtant, disgusting, seems to have been frequently used by the Weils, and from the time she could talk she often said, "I am disgusting." By the time she was 4, she disliked being kissed even by her parents, and for the rest of her life she displayed repulsion for most forms of physical contact. When she was 5, a friend of her parents, a doctor, was so touched by her beauty that he leaned down to kiss her hand. Simone burst into tears and cried, "Water! Water! I want to wash!" Simone Adolphine Weil was born on February 3, 1909, in her parents' apartment on the Rue de Strasbourg, just south of the Gare de l'Est. Since destroyed, the street was rebuilt as the Rue de Metz. When she was 5, her family moved to a larger flat on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. Her mother, née Salomea Reinherz, she had shortened her first name to Selma, came from a wealthy family of Jewish businessmen who had prospered in the import-export trade in many countries. Selma spent her first few years in Russia, which her parents left in the wake of the 1880s pogroms to move to Belgium. Hers was the more artistic side of the family. Her father wrote poetry in Hebrew, and her mother, who would live with the Weils until her death, was a gifted pianist. As for Dr. Bernard Weil, who was addressed by his children as Biri, he came from a family of Jewish merchants that had been settled for generations in Strasbourg. His politics were mildly left of centre, and he was an extreme secularist. He disliked talking about his Jewishness. This reluctance must have had its share of complexities, for his mother, who lived on in Paris into the 1930s, remained very pious. She kept a kosher kitchen, and proclaimed that she would rather see her granddaughter die than marry a Gentile. When visiting her son's family, she would follow her daughter-in-law Selma into the kitchen and scold her for cooking foods that were contrary to Jewish dietary laws. In this ritualistically hygienic family, Simone, who had been born a month premature, spent a very sickly infancy and childhood. When the baby was 6 months old, her mother continued to breastfeed her while recovering from an emergency appendectomy. Simone began to lose a great deal of weight and grew very ill. When she was 11 months old, Madame Weil was persuaded to wean her, but Simone, in an early struggle of conflicting wills, refused to eat from a spoon. She became so thin that several doctors gave her up for lost. Until the age of 2, she did not grow in height or weight, and had to be fed mush from bottles into which increasingly large holes were pierced. Reflecting as an adult on these early crises, which might have played a role in the severe eating problems she developed in adolescence, Simone sometimes speculated that she'd been poisoned in infancy by her mother's milk. "C'est pourquoi je suis tellement ratée," she'd say. "That's why I'm such a failure." Simone continued to be delicate throughout her childhood. At the age of 3, she took months to recover from her own appendectomy, which so traumatized her that for many years the sight of the Eiffel Tower, which she and her mother had had to pass on the way to the hospital, made her cry. Whenever a stranger came to visit her family, she even left the room in fear that he was a doctor. Her mother grew all the more obsessive about her daughter's health, pampering and cosseting the hypersensitive.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?